Midnight patrol. Dead quiet. The air tasted of synth oil and piss, a familiar cocktail in the underbelly of Sector 7. Kale moved through the shadows of the alley, his boots making no sound on the grimy pavement. The neon glow from the upper city barely pierced the perpetual smog down here, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ghosts. He preferred it this way. The quiet. The solitude. His world was a cage of his own making, fortified by routine and emotional detachment. Wake, check perimeter, run diagnostics, eat, patrol, sleep. A loop. A functional, empty loop. It kept the memories at bay. Most of the time. A flicker of movement ahead. Not a rat. Too big. He flattened himself against a rusted delivery truck, the cold metal of familiar comfort against his back. His hand rested on the grip of the heavy pistol holstered at his thigh. He didn't draw it. Not yet. Observation first. Action second. A lesson learned in blood and fire a lifetime ago. The sounds came next. A sharp crack, like bone breaking. A low hiss of pain that wasn't entirely human. He peered around the edge of the truck. 3 of them. Corporate enforcers by the look of their matte black armor and pulse rifles. Cornering someone against a graffiti-scarred wall. Their helmets hid their faces, turning them into anonymous instruments of violence. His instinct was to walk away. Not his fight. Not his problem. The sector had its own brutal ecosystem, and he was just a scavenger living in the margins. Getting involved meant complications. Complications meant attention. Attention meant death. But then he saw her. She was tall, impossibly lean, with skin that had a faint, silvery sheen under the sickly yellow light of a flickering street lamp. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was her. Blood, dark and thick, stained a deep gash on her side, and her movements were stiff, pained. Yet she stood defiant, a broken pipe clutched in one hand like a sword. Her eyes found his for a split second across the alley. They were a startling, luminous violet, and they burned with a fury that defied her obvious injury. They held no plea for help, only rage. One of the enforcers laughed, a distorted, metallic sound through his helmet speaker. Nowhere left to run. Princess. Princess. Interesting. She spat a word in a language he didn't understand, a string of harsh, guttural syllables that sounded like a curse. She lunged, not away, but toward them. A desperate, suicidal attack. She swung the pipe, connecting with the side of one enforcer's helmet with a loud clang. It barely fazed him. He backhanded her, the blow cracking across her jaw and sending her stumbling back against the wall. She slumped, but didn't fall. Her head hung for a moment, then lifted slowly, a thin line of silver blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Those violet eyes blazed. That was it. That was the moment the switch flipped. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the defiance. Maybe it was the way they called her princess with such contempt. Maybe he was just bored. Kale moved. He was a shadow detaching from other shadows. The first enforcer, the one who had struck her, never saw him coming. Kale's combat knife was in his hand, a seamless motion from sheath to flesh. He drove it up under the enforcer's helmet, severing the armored seal and the spinal cord beneath it. The man dropped without a sound. The other 2 turned, startled. Their reaction time was good. Military grade. But Kale was faster. He was already moving on the second one, his pistol now in his hand. He didn't fire. Too much noise. Instead, he used it as a bludgeon, slamming the reinforced butt of the weapon into the side of the man's helmet, shattering the visor and the bone beneath. The enforcer crumpled, gurgling. The third one managed to raise his pulse rifle. A mistake. It was too long for close quarters. Kale closed the distance in a single step, grabbing the barrel and twisting it violently. He heard the snap of the man's wrist. The enforcer screamed, a short, sharp sound that was cut off as Kale drove an armored elbow into his throat. The man fell, clutching his neck, his body convulsing. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Silence returned to the alley, broken only by the dying gurgle of the second enforcer and the distant hum of the city. Kale stood over the bodies, his breathing steady, his heart rate barely elevated. The violence was a familiar language, one he spoke with brutal fluency. He felt nothing. No satisfaction. No remorse. Just the cold, clean finality of the act. He wiped his knife on the dead enforcer's uniform and sheathed it. Then he turned to her. She had pushed herself upright, her back pressed against the wall. She held the pipe in a white-knuckled grip, her knuckles as pale as bone. Her violet eyes were fixed on him, narrowed with suspicion and hostility. She was watching him the same way she had watched the enforcers, like he was just the next threat. He took a step toward her. "Stay back," she hissed, her voice a low, strained whisper. He ignored her, his gaze dropping to the wound in her side. It was bad. The fabric of her strange, dark clothing was soaked through, and the bleeding hadn't stopped. She was swaying on her feet, the adrenaline that had kept her fighting now fading fast. "I didn't need your help," she said, the words a defiant protest. Cale stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the 3 bodies on the ground, then back at her. Her jaw was already swelling, and the silver blood from her lip traced a path down her chin. She was a mess of cuts and bruises, held together by sheer, stubborn pride. "I know," he said, his voice flat. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She had expected an argument, a dismissal of her strength. He gave her neither. "You're losing blood," he stated. It wasn't a question or an expression of concern. It was a fact, a tactical assessment. She glanced down at her side as if just remembering the wound. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she faltered, her hand flying to the wall to steady herself. Her bravado was a thin, cracking veneer over a body that was about to shut down. "I'm fine," she lied, her teeth gritted. Cale didn't waste time arguing. He holstered his pistol and closed the remaining distance between them. She tried to raise the pipe, but her arm felt like lead. He easily took it from her grasp and tossed it aside. It clattered against the pavement. "Don't touch me," she warned, but there was no heat left in her voice. Only exhaustion. He ignored her again. He slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. He lifted her. She was surprisingly light, all lean muscle and dense bone. She stiffened in his arms, a surge of defiant energy making her rigid. She tried to push against his chest, but it was a feeble gesture. "Put me down." "No," he said simply. He started walking, carrying her away from the carnage and deeper into the labyrinth of alleyways that he called home. She struggled for a moment longer, then went limp, her head falling against his shoulder. He felt her ragged breath against his neck. She hadn't surrendered. She had just run out of fuel. He moved through the darkness with an easy, practiced gait. The weight in his arms was a strange, unwelcome complication. He had spent years building a life of perfect isolation. In a single, impulsive act of violence, he had just shattered it. He didn't know who she was or why those enforcers wanted her. He didn't care. He had seen something in her eyes, a reflection of a fire he thought had been extinguished in himself long ago. And he had acted. Now he had to deal with the consequences. His sanctuary was a repurposed maintenance bunker, hidden behind a collapsed section of a derelict factory. The entrance was a heavy slab of reinforced steel, indistinguishable from the surrounding wall. He keyed in the code, and the door slid open with a low hiss of hydraulics. The air inside was cool and sterile, smelling of ozone and scrubbed metal. It was a stark contrast to the filth of the alleys. He carried her inside, and the door sealed behind them, shutting out the city and its noise. The main room was Spartan. A cot in one corner, a workbench covered in tools and disassembled electronics in another, a small, functional kitchen unit against the far wall. There were no decorations, no pictures, no personal items. Every object had a purpose. It was less a home and more a forward operating base for a war that had ended years ago. He laid her down on the cot. It was the only soft surface in the entire bunker. She moaned softly as her back touched the thin mattress, her eyes fluttering open. They were clouded with pain, but the suspicion was still there. She watched him as he moved to a storage locker and pulled out a medkit. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Home," he replied, without looking at her. He came back to the cot and knelt beside it. He opened the kit, the contents laid out with military precision. Synth-skin applicators, plasma coagulants, sterile bandages, potent painkillers. "I need to see the wound," he said. It was an order, not a request. She stared at him for a long moment, her violet eyes searching his face for something. A motive, a weakness. He met her gaze with a blank, unreadable expression. He was used to being scrutinized. He had learned long ago to offer nothing for people to read. With a grimace of pain, she pushed herself up slightly and pulled at the torn fabric of her tunic. She hissed as the material separated from the drying blood around the gash in her side. It was a deep cut, long and jagged. A blade wound. It was still weeping blood. They were trying to take me alive, she said, as if that explained the sloppy knife work. The clumsy one got lucky. Cale didn't respond. He soaked a sterile cloth with antiseptic. This will sting. He pressed the cloth to the wound. She arched her back, a sharp, ragged gasp escaping her lips. Her hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. But she didn't cry out. She just glared at him, her eyes watering from the sheer, searing pain. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound with a detached efficiency. He was a mechanic repairing a broken machine. Her skin was cool to the touch, and where it wasn't bruised or cut, it was smooth, with a texture like polished stone. The faint silver sheen seemed to pulse with a soft light of its own. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a mix of agony and defiant pride. He put the cloth aside and picked up the synth skin applicator. Hold still. He pressed the nozzle to her skin and began sealing the wound. A thin, transparent film covered the gash, the medical nanites inside immediately beginning the work of knitting flesh and muscle back together. She watched his hands, her breathing harsh and shallow. The proximity was unnerving. He could smell the strange, alien scent of her blood, a metallic, ozone-like odor. He could see the fine, almost invisible patterns on her skin, like the grain in a piece of marble. He was too close. This was the kind of intimacy he had sworn to avoid. It was a clinical act, a necessary procedure, but it felt like a violation of the walls he had built around himself. He finished sealing the wound and applied a sterile dressing over it. Done. He stood up and moved away, putting distance between them again. He needed the space. She slowly lowered herself back onto the cot, her movements stiff. She looked down at the clean white bandage on her side, then back at him. The hostility in her eyes had been replaced by a weary, cautious curiosity. Why? She asked. It was the one question he didn't want to answer, mostly because he didn't have an answer himself. You were a complication in my patrol route, he said, his voice a low growl. A faint smile touched her swollen lips, a ghost of an expression. A complication, she repeated the word, tasting it. You kill 3 armed men because I am a complication? They were loud, he said, turning away to clean and put away the medkit. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. He went to the kitchen unit and filled a cup with water. He brought it to her. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against his. A small jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She drank the water greedily, her throat working. When she was done, she held the empty cup, looking at it as if she had never seen one before. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice stronger now. Nothing, he said. Rest. Heal. Then leave. It's not that simple. They will be looking for me. They will have tracked me this far. Now they will be looking for you too. Let them look, he said. He felt a grim satisfaction at the thought. It had been a long time since anyone had been foolish enough to come looking for him. He broke a nutrient bar in half and tossed a piece onto the cot beside her. Eat. She eyed the gray, featureless block with disdain. What is it? Food. She picked it up, sniffed it, and took a small, tentative bite. Her expression didn't change. She ate it slowly, mechanically, as if forcing herself to refuel. Cale went to his workbench and began disassembling his pistol for cleaning. The familiar, methodical process helped him think. The bunker was secure, shielded from scans, reinforced against assault. But she was right. They would be back. They would sweep the sector grid by grid. He had brought the trouble to his own doorstep. He could have thrown her back out into the alley. But he knew he wouldn't. Not now. He had intervened. He had taken responsibility for her, whether he liked it or not. That was the rule. His rule. You break it, you buy it. She finished the nutrient bar and placed the wrapper neatly on the floor beside the cot. She watched him, her violet eyes tracking his every movement as he cleaned the components of his weapon. You fight like one of the Imperial Guard, she said quietly. But you are human. He didn't look up. I've been called worse. It was not an insult, she replied. They are the most elite warriors of my people. Disciplined. Lethal. Empty. He paused in his work, the slide of the pistol in his hand. Empty. The word hit its mark. You know nothing about me, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I know you saved my life, she countered, and I know you have not told me your name. It's Cale. The name felt foreign on his tongue. He hadn't said it to another person in years. Lyra, she offered in return. A name for the complication. Lyra. He finished cleaning the pistol and began to reassemble it with practiced ease. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. He was a man who craved silence, but this was a different kind. It was an active, listening silence. A standoff. He finished with the gun and set it on the bench. He turned to face her. She was sitting up on the cot, her back straight despite her injuries. She looked like a queen holding court on a throne of rags. Proud. Unbroken. "Now what, Cale?" she asked. Before he could answer, a low hum vibrated through the concrete floor of the bunker. A deep, resonant sound that was felt more than heard. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy-class corporate transport hovering overhead. Cale was at the main console in an instant, his fingers flying across the keypad. A schematic of the area appeared on the screen. A single, large heat signature was directly above them. Several smaller signatures were deploying. "They're here," Lyra said. It wasn't a question. "Stay down," Cale ordered, his voice sharp. He moved to a weapons locker and keyed in a code. A panel slid open, revealing a pulse rifle, grenades, and extra ammunition. He grabbed the rifle, checked the charge, and slung it over his shoulder. The bunker's external sensors picked up audio. "Ground team, spread out. Sweep pattern Delta. Target is a high-value asset. Non-human female. Consider her armed and extremely dangerous. Authorization for lethal force is confirmed if she resists." The voice was cold, professional, and amplified by a loudspeaker. Cale watched the screen, his face a mask of stone. 6 of them, moving in a precise, tactical formation, sweeping the alleys around the factory. They were well-trained, well-equipped. Far more professional than the trio he had dealt with earlier. This was the A-team. Lyra pushed herself off the cot, her hand going to her bandaged side. She swayed, but she stayed on her feet. "I will not be taken. You're not fighting anyone in your condition," he said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "You can barely stand. I will die on my feet before I let them drag me back to that traitor." Her words confirmed his suspicion. This was political. A coup, an assassination. Something messy. A heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through the bunker. It wasn't at the door. It was on the factory roof, directly above them. One of the soldiers was right on top of their location. Then came a voice, amplified and clear, cutting through the layers of steel and concrete. "Occupant of this structure. This is Enforcer Command. We have you surrounded. We are searching for a fugitive. Cooperate, and you will not be harmed." Cale looked at Lyra. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. She was ready to fight. Ready to die. He turned to the comms panel. He could ignore them. They might not know for sure that he was here. They were just checking every possible hiding place. Or he could answer. He pressed the button to activate the external speaker. "This is private property," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Get off my roof." There was a moment of silence. The soldiers on the screen stopped their sweep. They were listening. "We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive, citizen," the voice from outside replied. "Open your door and allow us to conduct a search. Failure to comply will be seen as an act of aggression." Cale's eyes met Lyra's. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hand was clenched by her side. She expected him to fight, or to betray her. She was a cornered animal, ready to lash out at anything. He had a choice. He could open the door and hand her over. His life would go back to the way it was. Quiet, empty, safe. Or he could lie. He could make her problem his problem. He could choose complication. He could choose attention. He could choose death. He thought of her defiance in the alley, the fire in her eyes, the way she had refused to break. He keyed the comms again. "I've been down here all night," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Haven't seen anyone. Haven't heard anything. Now get the hell off my property before I file a complaint with the sector authority." It was a bluff. The sector authority was a joke, but it was the right kind of bluff. The kind an ordinary, law-abiding citizen would make. Another long pause. He watched the soldiers on the screen. Their body language was tense. Their leader, the one on the roof, was probably conferring with his superiors, weighing the options. Was it worth starting a firefight over a maybe? "Copy that, citizen." The voice finally came back, devoid of any emotion. "We will continue our search elsewhere. Our apologies for the disturbance." The heavy footsteps on the roof receded. On the screen, he watched the 6 soldiers regroup and move away, their search pattern resuming down the next alley. The large heat signature of the transport lifted off and followed them. Kale watched until they were out of sensor range. Then he turned off the screen. The silence in the bunker was absolute. Lyra was staring at him, her violet eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She had been so sure he would give her up. She had been ready for it. The lie had caught her completely off guard. "Why?" she whispered, the single word hanging in the air between them. "I don't like people on my roof," he said, shrugging off the pulse rifle and placing it back in the locker. He knew it was a weak answer, a deflection, but it was the only one he was willing to give. The real reason was a tangled knot in his gut that he had no intention of trying to unravel. She took a hesitant step toward him. "They will know you lied. They will have recorded my heat signature here before. When they find nothing, they will come back." "I know," he said. "We'll be gone before then." "We," she echoed. "You can't stay here. And you won't last an hour out there on your own." "So yes, we." He had just made another decision. Another complication. His life of isolation was not just shattered. It was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by a silver-skinned woman with violet eyes. She studied his face, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the hard lines etched around his mouth and eyes, the faint, pale network of scars on his cheek, the utter stillness of his expression. He was a fortress, and he had just opened the gate for her. "You have no idea what you've just involved yourself in," she said, her voice a low warning. "Give me a summary," he said, moving to the workbench and pulling out a duffel bag. He began to pack it with methodical efficiency: ammunition, ration packs, a water purifier, the medkit. Lyra watched him for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision of her own. She had trusted him with her life, however unwillingly. Now she would trust him with her story, or part of it. "The people who hunt me are not enforcers," she began, her voice gaining a cold, regal authority. "They are mercenaries, hired by my sister." Kale paused, a magazine of pulse rounds in his hand. "Sister." "Xylia," Lyra said, the name like poison on her tongue. "She is the younger. Ambitious. Ruthless. She orchestrated a coup. Seized the throne that was rightfully mine. She has told our people that I am a traitor, that I tried to sell our world to a corporate syndicate. It is a lie. She is the one who made the deal. So she wants you dead to clean up the loose ends." Kale finished for her. "She wants me captured," Lyra corrected him, a bitter twist to her lips. A public trial and execution would be much more theatrical. It would solidify her claim. She is a great believer in political theater. "Queen," he said, the pieces clicking into place. "They called you princess." "I was to have my coronation on the day she made her move," Lyra said, her gaze distant, lost in a memory of betrayal. "I am Lyra, of the House of Valerius, the rightful queen of Xylan." Kale zipped up the duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder. "Queen. Fugitive. Alien royalty." The situation had just escalated from complicated to completely insane. He looked at her. She stood there, a wounded queen in a mechanic's bunker, with a galaxy of trouble chasing her. And he had just painted a target on his own back to protect her. For the first time in a very long time, he felt something other than the cold, gray emptiness. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It felt something like purpose. "Well, Your Majesty," he said, his voice laced with a dry, sardonic wit he rarely used. "Let's not keep your sister waiting." They spent the next few hours in a tense, shared silence. Kale worked, prepping for their departure. He moved with a quiet, focused intensity that Lyra found both unnerving and fascinating. He stripped his cot for a thermal blanket, which he added to the duffel bag. He loaded a small, concealable holdout blaster and tucked it into his boot. He methodically wiped the bunker's short-term memory logs, erasing any trace of her presence. Lyra sat on the edge of the cot, a silent observer. The dose of painkillers he had given her had dulled the sharp edges of her agony, leaving a throbbing, persistent ache in its place. Her body screamed for rest, for deep, restorative sleep. But her mind refused to quiet. It raced, replaying the ambush, the fight, her escape, and his arrival. Kale, the human. He was a paradox. A brutal killer who showed a strange, detached kind of care. A loner who had just risked everything for a stranger. She couldn't understand him. His motives were a blank wall she couldn't find a purchase on. He was cleaning his combat knife, the one he had used in the alley. He worked with a slow, deliberate motion, honing the already razor-sharp edge. The light caught on a series of crude, jagged scars on the back of his hand and wrist. They were old wounds, poorly healed, as if they had been left to mend on their own. She found her gaze drawn to them. They were marks of a hard life. A violent life. "Where did you get those?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He didn't look up from his work. "Old job." The answer was a dismissal, a door shut in her face. But she persisted. "The Imperial Guard are branded upon graduation," she said, her fingers tracing a faint, intricate silver line on her own forearm. It was a delicate, swirling pattern, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right. "A mark of loyalty. A symbol of our oath." "Is that what those are?" "Marks of loyalty." Cale stopped his work. He set the knife and whetstone down on the bench. He turned, and for the first time, he let her see something past the blank mask. A flicker of old, cold anger. "They're the opposite of that," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled off his shirt. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. His back was a roadmap of violence. A tapestry of scar tissue. The neat, thin lines of blade cuts crossed with the puckered, discolored circles of energy weapon burns. But what dominated the landscape of his skin was the brand. A massive, ugly scar between his shoulder blades. It wasn't a symbol of loyalty. It was a mark of ownership. A corporate logo she recognized. Ares Industries. The biggest private military contractor in the outer sectors. "Ares Spec Ops," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Division 7. They owned us. Body and soul." The scars were just a reminder of the contract. She couldn't tear her eyes away. It was a brutal, ugly thing. A declaration that he was nothing more than a piece of equipment, a corporate asset to be used and discarded. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "The contract ended," he said, pulling his shirt back on. He turned away from her, the moment of vulnerability over as quickly as it had begun. "I retired." She knew it was more than that. No one just retired from a unit like that. You deserted, or you died. He was still breathing, so that left only one option. He was a fugitive too, just a different kind. A quiet understanding passed between them. They were both running from their pasts, both branded by forces that had tried to control them. The silence that followed was different, less tense, more companionable. They were two broken soldiers from different wars, hiding in the same foxhole. The air in the bunker began to shift. The enforced proximity, the shared danger, the brief, stark revelation of his past, it all combined to change the dynamic between them. The space felt smaller, the air thicker. Cale could feel it. He could feel her eyes on him as he worked. It was a physical sensation, like a pressure on his skin. He was acutely aware of her, of the sound of her breathing, of the faint, alien scent that clung to her. He kept his back to her, focusing on his tasks. Inventory. Route planning. He was a master of compartmentalization. But the box he kept his instincts in was beginning to rattle. "You look at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle," he said, without turning around. "You are a puzzle," she replied, her voice a low murmur. "A man who lives in a steel box, who kills without hesitation, who lies to protect a queen he doesn't know. It's not that complicated," he growled. "I saw a fight. I picked a side." "You picked the losing side," she pointed out. "Looks that way," he admitted. He turned to face her, leaning back against the workbench. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive posture. "You think I don't see it? The way you watch me? You're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for me to name my price." Her chin lifted, a flash of her regal pride returning. "And what is your price, Cale? What does the man who has nothing want?" "I told you. Nothing. Everyone wants something," she insisted, standing up and taking a step toward him. She was still unsteady on her feet, but she moved with a deliberate grace that even her injuries couldn't hide. "Power. Wealth. Revenge. What is it you crave?" He stared at her, at the intensity in her violet eyes. She was challenging him, pushing him, trying to break through his walls. "You think you know me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I know you're kind," she shot back, closing the distance between them until she was standing just inches from him. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "Warriors who have lost their war. You wander, looking for a new one to fight. A new cause to die for. Am I your new cause, human?" His hands clenched into fists at his sides. She was too close. Her words were too accurate. They cut deeper than any blade. "You're a job," he said, his voice harsh. "A piece of cargo I have to deliver from point A to point B. A flicker of hurt crossed her face before she masked it with anger. Am I? She whispered, her gaze dropping to his mouth. Is that all? The air between them crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the soldiers hunting them. It was a raw, primal energy, a magnetic pull that defied logic and reason. They were two predators, circling each other, testing each other's defenses. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He could smell her scent, stronger now, a mix of ozone and something else, something uniquely female and alluring. His instincts, the ones he had suppressed for so long, were screaming at him. Don't, he warned, his voice a strained rasp. But it was a warning to himself as much as to her. Or what? She challenged, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. She raised a hand and rested her palm flat against his chest. His heart hammered against her hand. Will you kill me too, Kale? To make the complication go away? That was it. The breaking point. He moved, his movements a blur of pent-up frustration and a desire he refused to name. He grabbed her, not gently, his hands sinking into the flesh of her upper arms. He spun her around and slammed her back against the cold steel of the workbench. The tools rattled. She gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else. Excitement. He caged her in, one hand on the bench on either side of her head. His face was inches from hers. He could feel her breath on his lips. Is this what you want? He snarled, his control stretched to its absolute limit. You want to see the monster? You want to see what Ares Industries paid for? Her eyes didn't waver. They held his, defiant and unafraid. I am not afraid of monsters, she breathed. I was raised by them. And then she closed the final inch between them. Her mouth was on his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, angry claiming. Her lips were soft but demanding, her teeth grazing his. She tasted of blood and defiance and a loneliness that mirrored his own. For a heartbeat, he remained rigid, his mind screaming at him to pull away, to shove her back, to reestablish the distance that kept him safe. Then, with a low groan that was torn from the very depths of his soul, he surrendered. His mouth answered hers, his kiss just as hungry, just as brutal. He wasn't a protector. She wasn't a queen. They were just two damaged, desperate people, finding a moment of violent solace in the dark. His hands left the bench and went to her, one tangling in her long, dark hair, pulling her head back, the other sliding down her back to press her body flush against his. He could feel every lean, hard curve of her. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers digging into his shoulders, pulling him closer. It was a frantic, clumsy, passionate battle. A fight for dominance that was also a mutual surrender. They tore at each other's clothes, the sound of ripping fabric loud in the silent bunker. He lifted her onto the workbench, scattering tools and schematics onto the floor. Her long legs wrapped around his waist, locking him to her. The cold metal was a shock against her bare skin, but she didn't seem to notice. Her focus was entirely on him, on his mouth, his hands, his body. This wasn't about love or tenderness. It was about something far more primal. It was about a shared darkness, about finding another soul who understood the language of violence and survival. It was a raw, physical exorcism of the pain and loneliness that had defined both their lives. In the cold, sterile bunker, surrounded by the tools of war and survival, they found a different kind of sanctuary. A fleeting, explosive moment of connection that was as savage and as beautiful as a supernova. Afterward, they lay apart on the narrow cot, not touching. The air in the bunker was thick with the aftermath, the scent of their bodies, the sound of their ragged breathing. The passion had receded, leaving a raw, unnerving stillness in its wake. Cale stared up at the steel ceiling, his arm flung over his eyes. His body felt drained, but his mind was racing. What had he done? He had broken every one of his own rules. He had let someone in, not just into his home, but under his skin. Lyra lay on her side, her back to him. He could see the elegant curve of her spine, the faint silver sheen of her skin in the dim light. He didn't know what she was thinking. He didn't dare to ask. This changes nothing, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, directed at the wall. I am still a queen, and you are still you. I know what I am, he said, his voice a low rasp. He felt her shift, turning to face him. He didn't move. He didn't want to see the look in her eyes. Regret? Pity? He couldn't handle either. I don't do this, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I don't get involved. Neither do I, she replied softly. And yet, here we are. Here we are. Two fugitives, tangled together in a situation that was spiraling out of control. The brief, violent intimacy had not solved anything. It had only made things more complicated. It had forged a bond between them, a dangerous, unspoken connection that neither of them knew how to handle. He finally lowered his arm and turned his head to look at her. Her violet eyes were watching him, unguarded for the first time. He saw no regret there, only a deep, unsettling understanding. She saw him, not the monster, not the soldier, but the man, and it terrified him. We need to move, he said, his voice gruff as he sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. He needed to get back to what he knew. Action. Survival. They'll be back before dawn. She nodded, sitting up as well. She didn't flinch from the sudden nakedness between them. Her regal pride was an armor that clothed her more effectively than any fabric. She looked at the new bandage on her side, the one he had applied after their encounter. It was a stark white mark against her silvery skin, a reminder of both her vulnerability and his care. The moment was broken by a sudden, deafening explosion. The entire bunker shook, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. A high-pitched alarm began to blare. On one of the monitors, red lights flashed, indicating a catastrophic structural breach. They're back, Lyra said, her voice grim. They didn't come back to talk, Cale snarled, already on his feet and pulling on his pants and boots. He threw her clothes at her. They're blowing their way in. Another explosion rocked the bunker, this one closer, louder. A large crack appeared in the far wall, spitting sparks and smoke. They're using plasma charges, he yelled over the alarm. This place won't hold for long. He grabbed the duffel bag and his pulse rifle. He tossed the small holdout blaster to her. Do you know how to use that? She caught it with an expert's grace. I was trained with far more elegant weapons, but yes, I know how to make things die. A third explosion blew a gaping hole in the main door. Smoke and the smell of burnt metal flooded the room. Through the haze, Cale could see the silhouettes of armored soldiers pouring in. This way, he yelled, grabbing her arm. He dragged her toward the back of the bunker, to a small, unassuming maintenance hatch set into the floor. It leads to the old sewer system. He kicked the hatch open and gestured for her to go first. She didn't hesitate, swinging her legs into the dark opening and disappearing down a ladder. Cale fired a burst from his pulse rifle toward the advancing soldiers, forcing them to take cover. He didn't wait to see if he hit any of them. He just needed to buy a few seconds. He dropped a flashbang grenade onto the floor, then swung himself into the hatch, pulling the heavy steel lid closed just as the grenade went off with a blinding flash and a deafening bang. He scrambled down the rusty ladder, his feet hitting the grimy floor of the sewer tunnel below. Lyra was already there, the blaster held ready in her hand, her eyes scanning the darkness. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of shouting and heavy boots on the steel floor of the bunker. His home, his sanctuary, it was gone. They had taken it from him. Move, he said, his voice cold with a rage he hadn't felt in years. They ran. The tunnels were a dark, stinking labyrinth. The air was thick with the smell of decay and chemicals, and the only light came from the small tactical flashlight mounted on Cale's rifle. The ground was slick with slime, and the sound of dripping water echoed off the curved walls. Unseen things scuttled away from the beam of their light. They moved quickly and silently, Cale in the lead, his senses on high alert. He knew these tunnels. He had used them before to move through the sector unseen, but he had never been hunted through them. Lyra kept pace with him, her movements surprisingly sure-footed in the treacherous environment. She was hurt, exhausted, but she didn't complain. She didn't slow him down. She was a survivor. He had to give her that. After what felt like an hour, he found a small, dry alcove, a junction for maintenance workers that had been abandoned for decades. We rest here, he said, sweeping the beam of his light around the small space. It was empty, save for some rusted tools and the thick webs of whatever spiders grew this big in the dark. Lyra sagged against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline from the escape was wearing off, and the pain in her side was returning with a vengeance. He saw her wince as she slid down to the floor. He handed her the water purifier and a canteen. Drink. While she drank, he stood guard at the entrance to the alcove, his rifle at the ready, listening to the sounds of the tunnel. The distant drip of water. The low hum of the city above. Nothing else. For now, they were safe. He risked a glance back at her. She sat huddled in the darkness, a fallen queen in a kingdom of filth and decay. She looked small and vulnerable. But he knew better. He had felt the steel in her spine. He had tasted the fire in her kiss. The full story, he said, his voice low. I want all of it. No more secrets. She looked up at him, her violet eyes luminous in the gloom. She took a deep breath. My sister, Xylia, was always the ambitious one, she began, her voice a low, bitter monotone. I was the heir. She was the spare. She resented it. She hid her resentment behind a mask of loyalty, but I saw it. I felt it. She made alliances in the shadows. With military commanders who felt they were being overlooked. With corporate interests who wanted access to Xylan's mineral wealth. Ares Industries? Kale asked, the name tasting like poison. Lyra nodded. Among others. They provided her with the mercenaries, the technology, the funding. In exchange, she promised them exclusive mining rights to our most sacred lands. She sold our heritage for a throne she couldn't win on her own. She paused, taking another sip of water. They staged the coup perfectly. They framed me for treason, using forged communications that made it look like I was the one dealing with the corporations. They turned my own royal guard against me. The few who remained loyal to me were cut down. I barely escaped with my life, thanks to one of my guards who created a diversion. So you ran? Kale said. I ran, she confirmed. I came here, to this sector. I had a contact, a sympathizer who was supposed to help me get off-world, to rally support from our allies in the outer systems. But Xylia's people must have gotten to him first. It was a trap. The men in the alley, they were waiting for me. So that was it. The whole, messy story. A tale of betrayal, greed, and political ambition. It was a story as old as time, just with spaceships and aliens. Kale felt a cold, familiar anger settle in his gut. He knew all about betrayal. He knew what it was like to be sold out by the people you trusted. We can't keep running, he said, his mind already shifting from defense to offense. They have resources. They have numbers. They'll hunt us down eventually. What do you suggest? Lyra asked, her eyes searching his. We have nothing. We are two people against an army. An army needs a head, Kale said, a grim smile touching his lips. You cut off the head, the body dies. You said they're using a comms tower as a base of operations. Lyra's eyes widened as she understood his meaning. The old Meridian Spire. It's in the heart of the commercial district. It's a fortress. Every fortress has a weakness, he said. We're not going to run anymore. We're going to hunt. We're going to take the fight to them. We're going to take their tower. It was an insane plan. Suicidal. Two people against a fortified corporate headquarters filled with trained mercenaries. But as he looked at her, he saw the fire leap back into her eyes. He saw the queen return. Just the two of us, she breathed, a hint of awe in her voice. Just the two of us, he confirmed. For the first time since he had met her, Lyra smiled. A true, genuine smile. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of pain and exhaustion. You are completely mad, Kale, she said. I've been called worse, he replied. The plan was simple and brutal. They would use the sewer and maintenance tunnels to get as close to the Meridian Spire as possible. They would find a way in through the sublevels, bypass as much security as they could, and then fight their way to the command center at the top of the tower. Once there, Lyra could use their comms system to broadcast a message to her loyalist forces, exposing her sister's treachery and rallying them to her side. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than dying in a filthy tunnel. They spent the next day navigating the underbelly of the city. It was a slow, grueling journey. Kale pushed them hard, allowing only brief stops for rest and water. He was a machine, driven by a cold, relentless purpose. Lyra matched his pace, her stamina surprising him. She was wounded and exhausted, but her royal upbringing had given her an iron will. She refused to be a liability. They moved in a comfortable silence, their earlier tension replaced by a focused, professional synergy. They were a team now, a unit of two. They finally reached the sublevels of the spire late the next night. The air here was cleaner, the tunnels better maintained. They could hear the low thrum of the tower's power core vibrating through the walls. Kale found a ventilation shaft that led up into the tower's lower maintenance levels. It was a tight squeeze, a long, vertical climb up a rickety ladder in a pitch-black shaft. He went first, his rifle slung across his back. Lyra followed close behind, her injured side protesting with every upward pull. At one point, her foot slipped on a greasy rung. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain. Kale stopped instantly, looking down. He could just make out her silhouette in the darkness below. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I'm fine," she gritted out, her voice strained. "Keep going." He knew she was lying. He could hear the pain in her breath. Without a word, he began to climb back down. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Hold on," he said. He reached her and braced himself on the ladder. "Get on my back." "What?" "No, I can make it." "We don't have time to argue," he said, his voice leaving no room for debate. "Get on my back, or I'll throw you over my shoulder. Your choice." She hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with the exhaustion and pain that was threatening to overwhelm her. Finally, she relented. She wrapped her arms around his neck and he adjusted her weight, her body pressed against his back. He took her full weight, his muscles straining with the effort. Then he began to climb. It was a brutal, punishing ascent. Every upward pull was a monumental effort. Her breath was hot on his neck. Her body was a warm, solid weight against his. He focused on the rhythm of the climb, on the feel of the cold metal rungs in his hands, on the burning in his muscles. He shut out everything else. They finally reached the top of the shaft. He pushed open the grate and pulled himself out into a dimly lit maintenance corridor. He then reached back down and helped Lyra out. She collapsed against the wall, her legs trembling. He stood over her, his own body aching from the strain of the climb. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He just nodded, his chest heaving. It was another moment of forced intimacy, of reliance. Another crack in his armor. They moved through the maintenance corridors like ghosts. The tower was quiet, on low alert. The mercenaries were confident in their security. Their mistake. Kale took out 2 guards in a security checkpoint with ruthless efficiency, using his knife to keep it silent. They moved past the bodies without a second glance. As they got higher in the tower, the architecture became more sleek, more corporate. The grimy maintenance corridors gave way to polished chrome and holographic advertisements. They were in the lion's den now. They found the central elevator shaft. Kale sliced open a control panel and hot-wired the system, calling a car to their floor. It was a risk, a big one, but it was faster than taking the stairs. The ride up to the penthouse command center was the longest minute of Kale's life. He stood with his back to the wall, rifle ready. Lyra stood beside him, her blaster held in a 2-handed grip. They didn't speak. They just listened, waited. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. All hell broke loose. The command center was a massive, open-plan room with a panoramic view of the city lights. It was filled with technicians and at least a dozen heavily armed mercenaries. They had been waiting for them. An alarm was already screaming. "Trap!" Kale yelled, shoving Lyra behind him as he opened fire. The room erupted in a storm of plasma bolts. Kale laid down a suppressing fire, forcing the mercs to dive for cover behind consoles and terminals. Sparks flew as shots went wide, shattering screens and equipment. The main console, Lyra shouted over the din, "I need to get to it." It was on a raised platform at the far end of the room. Between them, and it was a kill zone. "Cover me," she yelled. She broke from behind him and sprinted across the open floor, her movements fluid and impossibly fast. She was no longer a wounded fugitive. She was a warrior queen, reclaiming her throne. Kale moved with her, his pulse rifle spitting death. He became a whirlwind of controlled violence, his training taking over. He didn't think. He just reacted. Target acquisition, sight picture, trigger pull. One target down. Move to the next. He was a machine built for this. He saw a merc take aim at Lyra's exposed back. He didn't have a clear shot, so he threw himself forward, tackling another enemy and using the man's body as a shield as he fired. The bolt that would have hit Lyra slammed into the merc's chest armor. Lyra reached the platform. She vaulted over the railing and slid to a stop in front of the master console, her fingers already flying across the holographic interface. "Buy me time, Kale," she screamed. He grunted in response, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. He was drawing all the fire now. They knew she was the objective. Two bolts slammed into the wall next to his head, showering him with debris. He ducked behind a server bank, the heat of the shots searing his cheek. They were fighting as one. A perfect, deadly synergy. He was the shield, the brute force. She was the objective, the rapier's point. They moved and fought as if they had been training together for years, instinctively knowing what the other would do. A new voice cut through the chaos, cold and imperious, broadcast over the room's speakers. "Well, sister, you always did have a flair for the dramatic." A section of the far wall slid open, revealing a private observation deck. A woman stood there, flanked by two massive guards in ornate, silver armor. She was the mirror image of Lyra, but where Lyra's beauty was fierce and wild, this woman's was cold and cruel. Her eyes were the same luminous violet, but they held no fire. Only ice. "Xylia." "It's over, Lyra," Xylia said, a smug smile on her face. "Did you really think you could win? With this human?" "I came to take back what is mine, Xylia," Lyra yelled, her fingers never stopping their frantic work on the console. "Your reign of lies is over." "Is it?" Xylia laughed. She gestured to her guards. "Kill the man. Bring me my sister." The two elite guards dropped from the balcony, their armored boots hitting the floor with a heavy thud. They were armed with energy glaives, humming with power. They ignored the remaining mercenaries and advanced on Kale. Kale fired at them, but the shots sizzled against their personal energy shields. They were walking tanks. He abandoned the rifle and drew his combat knife. If he was going to die, he was going to die up close. He met their charge with a savage grace of his own. He ducked under the swing of a glaive, the humming blade passing inches over his head. He drove his knife into the weak point at the guard's knee joint. The man roared in pain and stumbled. The second guard brought his glaive around in a sweeping arc Kale couldn't dodge in time. He raised his arm to block, the armored vambrace on his forearm taking the brunt of the impact. The energy blade shrieked against the metal, and a searing pain shot up his arm. His armor held, but barely. Lyra screamed his name. She was almost done. The broadcast was cued. She just needed a few more seconds. Kale saw Xylia draw a small, elegant pistol. She wasn't aiming at him. She was aiming at Lyra. At her sister's back. There was no time to shout a warning. No time to think. Kale shoved the wounded guard into his partner and launched himself across the room, a desperate, flying tackle. He put himself directly in the line of fire. He felt the impact before he heard the shot. A white-hot, searing agony erupted in his shoulder and chest. It felt like being hit by a freight train made of pure fire. The force of the blast threw him backward, his body slamming into the console next to Lyra. Everything went white, then gray. He could hear a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He looked down and saw the smoking, cauterized hole in his armor, his flesh blackened and fused beneath it. Kale. Lyra's scream was filled with anguish. His sacrifice had given her the opening she needed. As Xylia stared in shock at what she had done, Lyra spun around, the holdout blaster in her hand. She fired once. The shot hit Xylia in the shoulder, the same place Kale had been hit. The usurper queen cried out and staggered back, dropping her pistol. At the same time, Lyra's free hand slammed down on the console. Execute. Her face, fierce and defiant, appeared on every screen in the room and on every screen across the city. Her voice, filled with righteous fury, boomed from the speakers. "People of Xylan, I am Lyra Valerius, your rightful queen. I live. My sister, Xylia, has betrayed us all." Kale's vision was tunneling. The last thing he saw was Lyra standing over the console, a beacon of righteous fire, as her loyalist forces, now alerted and rallied, began their assault on the tower. Then the darkness took him. He woke to the smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of medical machinery. He was in a bright, clean room, lying on a bed that was impossibly soft. For a moment, he thought he was dead. He tried to sit up, but a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest and shoulder forced him back down with a groan. "Don't move, you idiot." He turned his head. Lyra was sitting in a chair beside his bed. She was dressed in a simple but elegant silver tunic. Her cuts and bruises were gone, healed by some advanced medical technology. She looked every bit the queen, but her eyes, fixed on him, were filled with a raw, fierce concern that was anything but regal. "What happened?" he rasped, his throat dry. "You won," she said, a small, tired smile on her lips. "We won." My loyalist forces took the tower. Xylia is in custody. The corporate council has officially withdrawn their support for her claim. They are rats, fleeing a sinking ship. Good, he managed to say. The medics said the plasma bolt missed your heart by millimeters, she continued, her voice soft. Your armor saved you. That, and the fact that you are apparently too stubborn to die. He looked down at his chest. Through the opening in the medical gown, he could see a massive, angry red scar where the medics had regenerated the tissue. Another mark to add to his collection. How long was I out? 3 days, she said. I haven't left this room. He looked at her, really looked at her. The weight of command was already settling on her shoulders, but beneath it, he could still see the defiant woman from the alley. The woman who had fought him, challenged him, and met him in a moment of shared darkness. You should be out there, he said. Queening. I will be, she said. I have to address the High Council. I have to make a formal declaration of my ascension. They are waiting for me. She stood up, and for a moment, he thought she was going to leave. Instead, she walked to the large window that overlooked a breathtaking alien cityscape. Gleaming silver spires pierced the clouds of a purple sky. It was Xylan, or at least a part of it. They had brought him here. I am a queen because of you, Kale, she said, her back to him. You saved me. You fought for me. You almost died for me. The people need to see that. The council needs to understand it. She turned to face him, her expression serious, her violet eyes burning with an intensity that took his breath away. I am going to make my address now, she said, and I want you by my side. A few hours later, Kale stood in the shadows of a vast, ornate chamber. His arm was in a sling, and he was dressed in a simple, dark uniform that Lyra's attendants had provided. He felt out of place amidst the soaring arches and holographic banners of the Xylonian throne room. Lyra stood on a raised dais, a simple silver circlet on her head. She was addressing the assembled members of her High Council, their images shimmering as holograms from across the planet. Her voice was strong, confident, filled with the authority of a born ruler. She spoke of her sister's betrayal, of the corporate corruption that had almost cost them their world. She spoke of a new era of strength and integrity. Then she turned, and her eyes found him in the shadows. I did not do this alone, she said, her voice echoing in the silent chamber. I survived because of the courage of an outsider. A human, a warrior who had no stake in our fight, who owed me nothing, but who chose to stand with me against an entire army. She gestured for him to step forward. Every holographic head in the room turned to stare at him. He felt 1,000 eyes on him, scrutinizing him, judging him. He met their gazes without flinching, his face a mask of stone. He walked to her side, stopping just behind her. This man, Kale, is more than just an ally, Lyra declared, her voice ringing with conviction. He is my shield, my anchor in the storm. He has shown a loyalty that many of my own people forgot. He is the proof that strength is not found in titles or bloodlines, but in action. She paused, letting her words sink in. The council members murmured among themselves, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning understanding. Lyra took a deep breath and delivered her final, stunning decree. I offer my people stability and strength. He has offered me the same. Therefore, he will not be just a guest in my court. He will not be just a commander of my armies. He will stand with me. Always. She turned to him, her eyes locking with his. In that moment, the rest of the world faded away. There was only the two of them. He will stand with me, she repeated, her voice softer now, but no less powerful, as my consort, as my king. It was not a proposal. It was a declaration, a political move, a statement of power, and something more, something deeply personal. Before he could react, before the stunned council could protest, she reached up, pulled his head down, and kissed him. It wasn't like their first kiss in the bunker. This was not a kiss of anger or desperation. It was a kiss of ownership, of claiming. It was a public sealing of their bond, a message to her world and to the galaxy. This man is mine. We are one. When she pulled away, the chamber was silent. She had left them all speechless. She kept her hand on his cheek, her thumb stroking the rough scar on his jaw. You are not a complication, Kale, she whispered, for his ears only. You are my foundation. Later, they stood on a private balcony overlooking the capital city. The 2 moons of Xylan hung in the purple sky, casting a soft, silver light over the gleaming spires. The air was clean and cool. It was a world away from the filth and smog of Sector 7. He was no longer a loner hiding in a bunker. He was a king, or something like it. The thought was so absurd he almost laughed. They will challenge this, he said, his voice a low rumble. The council, the old houses, they will not accept an outsider, a human, as their king. Let them try, Lyra said, her voice laced with steel. She stood beside him, not touching, but he could feel the warmth of her body next to his. I am the queen. My word is law, and you are my law. The fight to reclaim her throne was over, but the war to keep it was just beginning. There would be assassins in the shadows, political maneuvering in the court, rebellions in the outer provinces. It would be a lifetime of conflict. But as he looked at her, at the Queen of Xylan, at the woman who had dragged him back into the light, he realized he didn't mind. His life of empty, quiet solitude was over, and he didn't miss it. Her hand found his, her long, cool fingers lacing with his scarred, calloused ones. A perfect fit. Are you ready for what comes next? She asked, her violet eyes searching his face. Cale turned his head and looked at her. He saw his past, his present, and his future all reflected in those luminous depths. He saw a new war to fight. He saw a new cause. He saw a home. He didn't say a word. He just squeezed her hand. It was answer enough.